The Texas sun beat down merciless on Red Creek as Ethan Cole finished wrapping a splint around the leg of Samuel Morrison's prize mare. The horse had stepped in a gopher hole that morning, and Samuel had ridden hard into town looking for the man everyone called the Animal Doctor. Ethan worked with practiced efficiency, his hands steady and sure as they secured the bindings that would let the leg heal properly over the coming weeks. Samuel watched with the relieved expression of a man whose livelihood depended on his animals. "That mare's worth more than my house," he said. "Doc Patterson's been gone 4 days now dealing with that fever outbreak over in Sweetwater. Glad we got you for the animals at least." Ethan nodded but said nothing, focused on his work. He had learned. Over 3 years in Red Creek, that silence served him better than conversation. The less people knew about his past, the fewer questions they asked about why a man with clear medical training limited himself to treating livestock. "She'll need rest for 6 weeks, Ethan finally said, his voice carrying the flat tone of someone who gave instructions without inviting discussion. "Keep her in the stable, no weight on that leg. I'll check on her in 3 days. Samuel pulled out his payment, counting coins into Ethan's hand. "You ever think about treating people, Cole? Town could use another doctor, especially with Patterson, getting older, and these outbreaks keeping him away for weeks at a time." Ethan's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. "I treat animals. That's my work." Samuel shrugged, sensing the closed door in Ethan's response. "Just seems a waste is all. Man with your knowledge and steady hands, limiting yourself to horses and cattle." After Samuel left, Ethan cleaned his instruments with methodical care, arranging them in his worn leather medical bag with the precision of ritual. The bag had been a graduation gift from his father 12 years ago, back when Ethan had been doctor. Ethan Cole, practicing physician in Boston with a promising career ahead of him. That life felt like it belonged to a different person now, someone naively confident in his abilities and his future. The memory he kept locked away tried to surface, as it did whenever anyone suggested he treat humans. A young woman's face, pale and frightened, trusting him to save her during a complicated childbirth. His own panicked decisions as things went wrong. The blood, so much blood, and his hands shaking as he realized his error had cost 2 lives instead of saving them. The medical board's investigation, the revoked license, the whispers that followed him through Boston until he could no longer bear to hear his own name spoken with disappointment and accusation. He had come to Texas to disappear, to find some kind of purpose that did not require him to hold human lives in his fallible hands. Animals were simpler. They did not look at him with hope and trust. They did not have families who would blame him if his best efforts failed. And if he made mistakes, the consequences felt more bearable, less like carrying the weight of souls on his conscience. Ethan was closing up his small clinic, really just a converted stable behind the general store, when he heard the commotion, shouts carried on the hot afternoon air, urgent and panicked. He tried to ignore it, tried to maintain the boundary he had carefully constructed between himself and human suffering. But the voices grew louder, closer, and he recognized the particular tone of emergency that every medical professional learned to identify instinctively. Against his better judgment, Ethan stepped out into the dusty street. A crowd had gathered, near the new church being constructed on the edge of town. He could see people running, hear someone crying out for help. His feet carried him toward the scene before his mind fully decided to go, old instincts overriding 3 years of careful avoidance. When he reached the crowd, he saw her. A young woman, maybe 25, lying on the ground near a collapsed scaffolding. Anna Pierce, he knew her slightly. She ran the seamstress shop and occasionally brought her cat in for minor ailments. She was conscious but clearly in severe pain, her face pale and drawn, one arm bent at an unnatural angle, and blood seeping through her dress at the shoulder. "Someone get Doc Patterson," a man shouted. "He's in Sweetwater," another voice responded. "Won't be back for at least 3 more days." The crowd parted slightly as people noticed Ethan's presence. He stood frozen, staring at Anna's injured form, feeling his heart race with familiar panic. This was exactly the situation he had spent 3 years avoiding. A human being in desperate need, no other help available, and his own traumatic past screaming at him to walk away before he could fail again and live with more blood on his conscience. Hannah's eyes found his through her pain. "Mr. Cole," she whispered, her voice tight with suffering. "It hurts. Please, it hurts so much." Those words, simple and desperate, cut through Ethan's defenses like nothing else could. He saw not just Anna, but every patient he had ever treated, every person who had looked to him for relief from pain and fear. He saw the woman in Boston, whose life he had failed to save, and he understood in that moment that running from one failure did not erase it. It only added the weight of everyone he failed to help afterward. Ethan knelt beside Anna, his medical training taking over even as his mind filled with doubt. His hands, which had been so steady with the horse an hour ago, trembled slightly as he gently examined her injuries. Dislocated shoulder, possibly broken collarbone, he assessed quickly. Significant bleeding from a wound near the shoulder joint. She needed help immediately, and he was the only person in Red Creek with the knowledge to provide it. "I need someone to get my medical bag from the clinic," Ethan heard himself say, his voice sounding distant even to his own ears. "And I need clean. Water, cloth for bandages, and whiskey for sterilization. Move quickly." People scattered to follow his instructions, grateful to have someone taking charge. Ethan stayed beside Anna, his hand instinctively moving to her uninjured wrist to check her pulse. It was rapid but strong, a good sign despite the severity of her injuries. Anna looked up at him through tears of pain. "You're the animal doctor. Can you help me?" Ethan met her eyes, seeing the trust there that he did not deserve, the hope he was terrified of failing to fulfill. "I'm going to try," he said quietly. "I'm going to do everything I can." As the townspeople rushed to gather supplies, as the Texas sun continued its merciless descent, Ethan Cole knelt in the dust beside a suffering woman and felt the weight of his past and future converging in this single moment. He had run from human medicine for 3 years, but life had just made running impossible. Now he would have to face his fears, confront his failures, and discover whether redemption was something that could be earned or only something that could be accepted as grace. They carried Anna to Ethan's clinic on a makeshift stretcher, moving as carefully as possible while she bit down on a leather strap to keep from crying out. Ethan walked beside her, his mind already racing through procedures he had not performed in years, calculating risks and preparing for complications. The afternoon had shifted into evening, and he knew the next hours would determine not just Anna's fate, but his own ability to ever practice medicine again. Inside the clinic, Ethan worked to transform the space he used for animals into something approaching a sterile environment for human surgery. He sent for more lamps, for the cleanest sheets anyone could provide, for every supply he might need. The townspeople responded with impressive efficiency, and within an hour he had assembled resources that were crude by Boston standards, but would have to suffice on the Texas frontier. Martha Jensen, the general store owner's wife and the closest thing Red Creek had to a nurse, volunteered to assist. She was a practical woman in her 50s who had helped Doc Patterson with countless emergencies over the years. She looked at Ethan with direct assessment, clearly wondering if the animal doctor could handle human medicine under pressure. "I'll need your help," Ethan told her honestly. "It's been 3 years since I treated a human patient. My hands remember the work, but I'll need someone to keep me grounded if I start to doubt myself." Martha nodded, respect showing in her expression. "Doc Patterson always says the best doctors are the ones who know their limitations. What do you need me to do?" Anna lay on the examination table, given a small amount of laudanum to ease the worst of her pain, but kept conscious enough to respond to instructions. Ethan examined her injuries more thoroughly, now that he had proper light and space. The dislocated shoulder was the most urgent issue. The longer it remained out of the socket, the more damage would occur to surrounding tissues. The collarbone appeared fractured, but not severely displaced. The bleeding had slowed, suggesting the wound was not as deep as he had initially feared. "Anna," Ethan said gently, positioning himself beside her. "I need to relocate your shoulder. It's going to hurt intensely for a few moments, but once it's back in place, you'll feel significant relief. I need you to trust me and try to stay as relaxed as possible." "Can you do that?" Anna's eyes were glassy with pain and laudanum, but she nodded. "I trust you, Mr. Cole." Those words landed like stones in Ethan's chest. The last person who had said those words to him had died because his trust had been misplaced. Ethan felt his hands begin to shake, felt the old panic rising. This was the moment he had feared for 3 years. The moment when someone's life depended on his ability to overcome his own trauma and perform with the confidence medicine required. Martha must have seen something in his face because she moved closer and spoke quietly. "You can do this. I've watched you set broken bones on horses that weigh 10 times what this girl weighs. You've got the steadiest hands I've ever seen when you're working. Whatever happened in your past that made you stop treating people, this is your chance to prove it doesn't define what you can do now." Ethan took a deep breath and positioned his hands on Anna's shoulder with the careful precision his father had taught him in medical school. He felt for the landmarks, assessed the angle of displacement, calculated the force and direction needed. Then, before doubt could paralyze him, he executed the maneuver with firm confidence. Anna cried out, a sharp sound of intense pain that cut through Ethan like a blade. For a terrible moment, he thought he had failed again, had made things worse. But then he felt and heard the distinctive sound of the joint sliding back into its socket, felt the shoulder align properly under his hands. Anna's cry transformed into a sob of relief as the acute agony of displacement gave way to the duller pain of traumatized tissues beginning their healing. "It's back," Ethan said, his voice shaking slightly. "The worst part is over." Martha squeezed his arm briefly, a gesture of support and recognition. She had seen what that moment had cost him, had witnessed him pushing through fear to do what needed doing. The rest of the evening passed in focused concentration. Ethan cleaned and stitched the shoulder wound, working by lamplight with Martha assisting. He immobilized Anna's shoulder and collarbone with careful binding, explaining each step to Martha as he worked, falling back into the teaching rhythm he remembered from his residency, when he had believed his future involved training the next generation of doctors. Anna drifted in and out of consciousness as the laudanum took full effect, but during her lucid moments, she watched Ethan with an expression of gratitude mixed with curiosity. "Why did you stop?" she asked at one point, her words slightly slurred. "Being a people doctor, I mean. You're good at this." Ethan did not answer immediately, focused on tying off a stitch with precise tension. When he finally spoke, his voice was low. "Because being good at something doesn't mean you never make mistakes. And some mistakes cost more than you can bear." Anna's eyes remained on him despite her drowsiness. "Everyone makes mistakes, Mr. Cole. Even Doc Patterson talks about patients he couldn't save, decisions he regrets. Being a doctor doesn't mean being perfect. It means trying to help even when you're scared you might fail." Her words, simple in their laudanum-softened wisdom, struck something deep in Ethan's chest. He had spent 3 years believing that his mistake disqualified him from practicing medicine, that his failure meant he had no right to hold human lives in his hands. But Anna, lying injured on his table, was suggesting a different truth, that medicine was not about perfection but about commitment to helping, despite the ever-present risk of failure. By midnight, Anna was sleeping peacefully, her breathing steady and her color improved. Ethan had done everything he could. Now came the waiting, the hours and days when infection or complications might appear despite his best efforts. He set up a cot in the corner of the clinic, unwilling to leave his patient overnight. Martha volunteered to stay as well, taking the first watch while Ethan tried unsuccessfully to sleep. Lying in the darkness, listening to Anna's breathing and the distant sounds of night on the Texas frontier, Ethan replayed every moment of the surgery in his mind. He analyzed his decisions, second-guessed his techniques, searched for errors that might have been avoided. It was an exhausting mental habit that he had developed after Boston, a way of punishing himself that never led to peace or resolution. But somewhere in the small hours of the morning, a different thought broke through the cycle of self-recrimination. He had helped Anna. Despite his fears, despite his shaking hands and his traumatic memories, he had performed the medical procedures she needed. She was sleeping comfortably, her injuries stabilized, her chances of full recovery good. That success did not erase his past failure, but it suggested that perhaps failure did not have to be the final word on his capabilities as a physician. When dawnlight began filtering through the clinic windows, Ethan rose from his cot and checked on Anna. Her forehead was cool, no sign of fever. Her pulse was strong and steady. The bindings he had applied remained secure and properly positioned. By every measure he could assess, she was healing. Martha woke as well, moving to stand beside him. "You did well," she said simply. Doc Patterson couldn't have done better himself. Ethan nodded, accepting the compliment but not quite able to believe it yet. She's not out of danger. Infection can set in within the first few days. Complications can develop from injuries we can't see. Martha smiled slightly. You sound like a real doctor, worrying about all the things that might go wrong. But you also sound like someone who cares about his patient, and that's the most important quality any healer can have. As morning fully arrived and Red Creek began to wake to a new day, Anna stirred and opened her eyes. She looked confused for a moment, disoriented by pain and medication, then focused on Ethan standing beside her table. "How bad is it?" she asked, her voice rough with sleep and discomfort. Ethan found himself smiling slightly, the first genuine smile he had worn in years. "You're going to be fine. The shoulder will take several weeks to fully heal, and you'll need to be careful with it for months. But you'll make a complete recovery if you follow instructions and let your body do its work." Anna's own smile was weak, but real. "Thank you, Dr. Cole. You saved me." The title struck Ethan like a physical blow. He was not Dr. Cole anymore, had not been for 3 years, but hearing it spoken with such genuine gratitude, such trust and respect, made him wonder if perhaps identities were not as fixed as he had believed. Perhaps the person he had been in Boston and the person he had become in Red Creek could somehow coexist, creating someone new, someone who carried the weight of past failures but was not crushed by them, someone who could help others heal while still healing himself. News of Anna's injury and Ethan's successful treatment spread through Red Creek with the speed that only small-town gossip could achieve. By mid-morning, people were stopping by the clinic with various excuses, bringing food for Anna, offering to help with chores, asking if Ethan needed any supplies. But the real reason for their visits was obvious. They wanted to see the animal doctor who had performed human surgery, and more importantly, they wanted to assess whether they could trust him with their own health concerns. Ethan had expected curiosity, but he had not anticipated the queue that began forming outside his clinic by afternoon. People who had been putting off medical issues because Doc Patterson was away suddenly decided their ailments needed immediate attention. A farmer with a persistent cough, a child with a sprained ankle, an elderly woman with arthritis pain, all appeared at his door with hopeful expressions and unspoken questions about whether the animal doctor might extend his services. Ethan felt overwhelmed by the attention. He had spent 3 years avoiding exactly this situation, maintaining strict boundaries between his veterinary work and the human medicine he had left behind. Now those boundaries had been shattered in a single emergency, and he did not know how to rebuild them or even if he should. Martha, who had appointed herself as his unofficial assistant and guardian, managed the crowd with firm efficiency. "Doc Patterson won't be back for at least 2 more days," she announced to the waiting people. "Mr. Cole has graciously agreed to handle urgent cases in the meantime. If your issue can wait for Doc Patterson's return, that would be appreciated. If it cannot wait, Mr. Cole will see you, but we must keep things orderly out of respect for Miss Pierce, who is recovering inside." The first patient Ethan agreed to was 7-year-old Timothy Burton, brought in by his mother with a badly sprained ankle from falling out of a tree. Ethan examined the boy with careful thoroughness, noting the swelling and discoloration, but also the full range of motion that suggested no fracture. He wrapped the ankle with practiced skill, instructed Timothy's mother on care and elevation, and sent them home with reassurance that healing would be complete within a couple of weeks. Mrs. Burton paused at the door, turning back with tears in her eyes. "Thank you, Mr. Cole. I was so worried, and having you here to help means more than you know. Doc Patterson is wonderful, but he's just one man serving 3 towns. Having someone else who can step in during emergencies, well, it might just save lives." Her words planted seeds of possibility that Ethan had not allowed himself to consider. He had been thinking of Anna's treatment as a singular exception, a crisis response that did not obligate him to anything further. But Mrs. Burton's gratitude, and the faces of the other people waiting outside his clinic, suggested that Red Creek needed more medical support than one aging doctor could provide. And more than that, they were willing to trust Ethan despite knowing nothing about his qualifications beyond his obvious competence. Between patients, Ethan checked on Anna, who was awake and alert despite her discomfort. She had been listening to the activity outside and smiled when he approached her bedside. "Sounds like you're becoming popular, Dr. Cole." Ethan shook his head slightly. "I'm not a doctor, not anymore. I'm just helping out until Doc Patterson returns." Anna studied him with the directness that seemed to be part of her nature. "Why did you stop being a doctor, if you don't mind me asking? Whatever happened, it must have been significant for you to give up something you're clearly skilled at." Ethan was quiet for a long moment, debating whether to share the truth that he had told no one in Red Creek. Something about Anna's open expression and the intimacy created by having saved her life made honesty feel less dangerous than usual. "I made a mistake," he finally said. "In Boston 3 years ago, a woman died in childbirth and her baby with her. It was a complicated delivery, and I made decisions that seemed right in the moment but turned out to be wrong. The medical board investigated, determined I had used poor judgment, and revoked my license." Hannah's expression showed compassion rather than the judgment Ethan had expected. "That must have been devastating. For you and for their family." "It was," Ethan acknowledged. "I couldn't practice medicine anymore. Couldn't even stay in Boston where everyone knew about my failure. So I came here, to a place where no one knew me, and I limited myself to treating animals. Animals don't trust you with their deepest hopes. They don't have families who will blame you if your best efforts aren't enough. I thought if I just avoided human patients entirely, I could avoid ever failing anyone that catastrophically again." Anna shifted slightly, wincing at the pain the movement caused. "But you did help me. Despite being scared, despite thinking you might fail, you helped me anyway." Ethan nodded slowly. "Because there was no other choice. You needed help, and I was the only one who could provide it." Anna smiled despite her discomfort. Maybe that's what being a doctor really means, not being perfect or never making mistakes, but being willing to help even when you're afraid, even when you know things might go wrong. My father used to say, that courage isn't the absence of fear, it's doing what's right despite being terrified. Her words resonated with something deep in Ethan's understanding. He had been defining medical practice by his single catastrophic failure, had let that one terrible night in Boston define his entire identity as a physician. But Anna was suggesting a different definition, one based not on perfection but on commitment to helping, despite the ever-present risk of inadequacy. The afternoon brought more patients, and Ethan found himself falling into rhythms he had not practiced in years. He treated a rancher's infected cut, removed a splinter from a child's hand, advised an expectant mother on nutrition and rest. Each case was relatively simple, but each one reinforced skills and confidence that had been dormant during his 3 years of veterinary-only practice. By evening, the queue had finally cleared, and Ethan sat exhausted in his clinic with Martha, cleaning instruments beside him. "You did good work today," Martha said. "Treated maybe 15 people, and every one of them left here better than they came in. That's what matters, not whatever happened in Boston." Ethan wanted to believe her, but doubt remained heavy on his shoulders. "These were simple cases, Martha. Nothing complicated, nothing life-threatening. Anna's injury was serious, but the procedures were straightforward. What happens when someone comes in with something truly complex, something where the wrong decision could cost them their life? I don't know if I can handle that kind of responsibility again." Martha set down the instrument she was holding and turned to face him directly. "None of us know if we can handle hard things until we're in the middle of them. You spent 3 years thinking you couldn't treat human patients because you were too broken by one failure. But yesterday you proved that wrong. Maybe you need to stop deciding in advance what you can't do and instead just respond to what's in front of you." Before Ethan could respond, a commotion outside interrupted their conversation. Voices raised in alarm, someone shouting for help. Ethan's heart sank, recognizing the sound of another emergency, another test of the abilities he was not sure he possessed. A man burst through the clinic door, wild-eyed and desperate. "It's my wife," he gasped. "The baby's coming early and something's wrong. She's bleeding, and the midwife says she needs a real doctor. Doc Patterson's still not back, and you're the only one who might be able to help." Ethan felt ice flood his veins. A difficult childbirth, the exact scenario that had destroyed his career in Boston, the nightmare that had haunted him for 3 years. Every instinct screamed at him to refuse, to explain that he was not qualified, that his last attempt at handling this situation had ended in tragedy. But then he looked at the desperate man in his doorway, saw the same terror he had seen in other husbands' faces, understood that somewhere in Red Creek, a woman was suffering and frightened, needing help that might not arrive in time if he refused. He thought about Anna's words, about courage being the willingness to act despite fear. He thought about Martha's observation that he could not decide in advance what he could not do. Ethan stood, his hands already shaking, his mind already racing through all the ways this could go catastrophically wrong. "Take me to her," he said, his voice steadier than he felt. "And someone run to get Martha. I'm going to need all the help I can get." The woman's name was Elizabeth Hart, and she lived in a small house on the edge of town with her husband, Thomas, who had come to fetch Ethan. When they arrived, Ethan found her in bed, pale and frightened, with Sarah Wilkins, the town midwife, standing beside her, looking deeply worried. Sarah was a competent woman with decades of experience, and the fear in her expression told Ethan this situation was as serious as he had feared. Sarah pulled Ethan aside immediately. "The baby's in distress," she whispered. "The bleeding's more than normal, and I think the position might be wrong. I've delivered probably 300 babies in my life, but this one's beyond my skill. She needs someone with surgical training and knowledge I don't have." Ethan felt his hands trembling as he moved to examine Elizabeth. This was his nightmare made real, the exact scenario he had fled from Boston to avoid. Every detail of his previous failure flooded his memory. The panic, the blood, the terrible realization that his decisions had been wrong, the haunting image of a woman and her baby both lost, despite his desperate efforts to save them. But this was not Boston. This was Red Creek, Texas, and he was not the same man who had failed 3 years ago. He had 3 more years of experience, 3 years of veterinary work that had taught him patience and careful observation. He had survived his worst fear yesterday with Anna's injury, and proven that past failure did not make future success impossible. And most importantly, he had no choice. Elizabeth needed help now, and he was the only person in town with the medical knowledge that might save her and her baby. Ethan examined Elizabeth with careful thoroughness, his medical training overriding his panic as he assessed the situation. The baby was indeed malpositioned, creating pressure that caused excessive bleeding. Elizabeth was exhausted from hours of labor, weakening with each passing moment. The situation was critical but not yet catastrophic. He had time to make careful decisions rather than rushing into the kind of panicked interventions that had contributed to his Boston failure. "Elizabeth," Ethan said gently, his voice projecting a calm confidence he did not entirely feel. "I'm going to help you through this. The baby's position is causing problems, but I can fix it. I need you to trust me and follow my instructions exactly. Can you do that?" Elizabeth nodded weakly, tears streaming down her pale face. "Please save my baby," she whispered. "Please don't let my baby die." Her words were nearly identical to what the woman in Boston had said, and for a moment Ethan felt himself transported back to that terrible night. But then Martha's voice broke through his flashback. "We need hot water, clean towels, and my medical supplies from the clinic," she was instructing someone. "And everyone who's not helping needs to leave the room. This woman needs space and calm, not crowds and panic." Martha's practical efficiency grounded Ethan, reminding him that he was not alone this time. He had an experienced assistant, a skilled midwife, and 3 years of lessons learned from his past mistakes. He could do this differently, do it better. Over the next 2 hours, Ethan worked with focused concentration to reposition the baby internally, a delicate procedure that required patience and precise touch. He explained each step to Sarah and Martha as he worked, creating a collaborative environment rather than the isolated panic he had experienced in Boston. When complications arose, he paused to consider options rather than rushing into decisions. When he felt uncertain, he voiced his doubts aloud and asked for input from Sarah's decades of midwifery experience. The contrast with his Boston failure could not have been more stark. Then he had been young and overconfident, too proud to admit uncertainty or ask for help. He had made decisions alone, convinced that his medical degree meant he should have all the answers. His panic had made him hasty, and his haste had cost lives. Now humbled by failure and matured by regret, Ethan worked with careful deliberation. He monitored Elizabeth's condition constantly, adjusted his approach based on her responses, and refused to let desperation push him into reckless action. When the baby finally began to move into proper position, when Elizabeth's bleeding started to slow, Ethan felt a surge of hope that he barely dared to acknowledge. The birth itself, when it finally came, was difficult, but ultimately successful. A baby girl emerged crying lustily, her color good, her lungs strong. Elizabeth, exhausted but conscious, reached for her daughter with trembling arms and tears of joy streaming down her face. Thomas stood beside the bed, his own face wet with emotion, murmuring thank you over and over until the words lost individual meaning and became simply a prayer of gratitude. Ethan remained for hours after the birth, monitoring both mother and child for complications, ensuring that bleeding stayed within normal ranges, watching for any signs of distress that would require intervention. But Elizabeth recovered steadily, and the baby, named Grace by her emotional parents, proved healthy and vigorous. By dawn, Ethan felt confident that both would survive and thrive. As morning light filled the Hart house, Sarah Wilkins pulled Ethan aside. "I've been a midwife for 32 years, she said quietly. "I've seen difficult births before, seen babies and mothers lost despite everyone's best efforts. But I've never seen anyone handle a crisis like you did tonight. You saved them both, Dr. Cole, and you did it by being careful when panic would have been easy, by asking for help when pride would have kept you silent, by treating this woman and her baby like they were the only things that mattered in the entire world." Ethan felt something break open in his chest, some wall he had built around his heart to protect himself from hope and vulnerability. He had saved them, despite his fears, despite his traumatic past, despite every reason to believe he would fail again. He had helped a woman through a dangerous childbirth and brought a healthy baby into the world. It did not erase his Boston failure, nothing could do that, but it proved that failure did not have to be forever. That redemption was possible through persistence and growth. When Ethan finally returned to his clinic, he found Anna awake despite the early hour. She had heard about Elizabeth Hart's emergency delivery and had been lying awake hoping for good news. Her face broke into a smile when she saw his expression. "They're both fine, aren't they?" Ethan nodded, suddenly too emotional to speak. He sank into a chair beside Anna's bed, exhaustion and relief washing over him in waves. "Both fine," he finally managed. "Mother and baby both healthy. It was difficult, but we managed it." Anna reached out her uninjured hand and squeezed his gently. "You managed it. You faced the thing you were most afraid of and came through it successfully. That's not just medicine, Dr. Cole, that's courage. That's redemption." Ethan closed his eyes, letting her words sink in. For 3 years he had defined himself by his worst moment, had let failure become his entire identity. But the past 24 hours had shown him a different truth. He was not just the doctor who had failed in Boston. He was also the doctor who had saved Anna Pierce from serious injury, who had treated Red Creek citizens with competence and care, who had successfully guided Elizabeth Hart through a dangerous childbirth. Those successes did not erase his failure, but they proved that failure was not the end of his story. Martha arrived at the clinic shortly after dawn, bringing breakfast and news that Doc Patterson had sent word he would be back by evening. She found Ethan and Anna talking quietly, and she smiled at the scene. "Looks like Red Creek's gained a doctor, whether he admits it or not." Ethan started to protest, to explain again that he was not officially licensed, that his credentials were permanently revoked, that calling himself a doctor felt like claiming something he had no right to claim. But Anna interrupted him before he could begin. "A title is just a word, Dr. Cole. What matters is what you do, not what people call you. You've helped everyone who came to you these past 2 days. You've saved lives. You've brought healing and hope to people who needed both desperately. If that's not being a doctor, then I don't know what is." Doc Patterson returned to Red Creek that evening, arriving tired from his days treating fever patients in Sweetwater, but immediately concerned about the medical emergencies he had heard rumors about during his absence. He went directly to Ethan's clinic, where he found Anna recovering comfortably, and Ethan organizing medical supplies with Martha's assistance. Patterson was a man in his 60s with kind eyes and the weathered appearance of someone who had spent decades serving frontier communities. He examined Anna with professional thoroughness, asked detailed questions about her treatment, and reviewed the notes Ethan had kept documenting procedures and recovery progress. Then he sat down heavily in a chair and studied Ethan with open curiosity. "I heard some interesting stories on my way back to town," Patterson said. "Heard the animal doctor performed surgery on Anna Pierce, treated a dozen citizens for various ailments, and successfully delivered Elizabeth Hart's baby under difficult circumstances, all while I was away. That's quite remarkable for someone who claims he only treats livestock." Ethan felt defensive instincts rise, but forced himself to respond honestly. "There were emergencies, and I was the only one available with medical knowledge. I did what needed to be done." Patterson nodded slowly. "Martha tells me you used to be a licensed physician back east, that you left that life behind after some kind of tragedy. She didn't know the details, but she said you were clearly running from something that haunted you." Ethan took a deep breath and told Patterson the whole story: the complicated childbirth in Boston, his errors in judgment, the deaths of mother and baby, the investigation and revoked license. He explained his 3 years of self-imposed exile from human medicine, his belief that he was not worthy of practicing again, his terror when faced with Elizabeth Hart's difficult delivery. Patterson listened without interruption, his expression thoughtful rather than judgmental. When Ethan finished, the older doctor was quiet for a long moment before speaking. "I've been a physician for 38 years, he finally said. "And in that time I've lost patients. Not many, thankfully, but some. There was a boy who died from infection because I didn't recognize the symptoms fast enough. A man who bled to death after a farming accident because I couldn't stop the hemorrhage. A woman with a growth I didn't understand until it was too late to help her." He paused, his eyes distant with memory. "Each loss haunted me. Each one made me question whether I should continue practicing, whether I had any right to hold people's lives in my hands when I had proven I could fail them so completely. But an old mentor told me something that changed how I thought about medicine. He said that doctors who never fail are either lying or not trying hard enough, that the measure of a physician is not whether they make mistakes, but whether they learn from them and keep trying to help people anyway." Patterson leaned forward, his gaze intent on Ethan. "You made a terrible mistake 3 years ago. A woman and her baby died because of errors in your judgment. That's a heavy burden to carry, and I don't blame you for running from it. But Ethan, you can't let one failure define your entire medical career. The past 2 days have shown that you've learned from that tragedy, that you approach difficult cases with more caution and wisdom than you had before. You saved Elizabeth Hart and her baby precisely because you remembered what went wrong in Boston and made different choices this time." Ethan felt tears burning behind his eyes. He had spent 3 years believing that his failure meant he should never practice medicine again, that attempting to help people would only risk repeating his catastrophic mistake. But Patterson was suggesting something different, that his failure had made him a better doctor, had taught him lessons that ultimately saved lives. "The question is what you do now," Patterson continued. "Red Creek needs medical support. I'm getting older, and these trips to neighboring towns are becoming harder. I could use a partner, someone to share the workload and help cover emergencies when I'm away. But more than that, this territory needs healers, people willing to bring medicine and hope to places that have precious little of either. You could be that person if you're willing to forgive yourself enough to try." Ethan looked around his clinic, seeing not just the converted stable it had been, but the potential for what it could become. He thought about Anna's words about courage, meaning action despite fear. He thought about the grateful faces of the people he had helped over the past 2 days. He thought about little Grace Hart, healthy and alive because he had been willing to face his deepest fear rather than running from it. "I don't have a license anymore," Ethan said quietly. "I can't legally call myself a doctor or practice medicine officially." Patterson waved a dismissive hand. "This is Texas Frontier, not Boston Society. Out here, competence matters more than credentials. If you can help people and do it safely, nobody's going to ask to see your medical license. And if you're worried about it, I can supervise your practice officially. Take legal responsibility while you rebuild your confidence and skills. Eventually, you might even be able to petition for license restoration, especially with documented successful practice and strong recommendations." The possibility Patterson was offering felt both terrifying and exhilarating. Ethan had spent 3 years in self-imposed exile, convinced his medical career was permanently over. But here was a respected physician suggesting not just that Ethan could practice again, but that his past failure had prepared him to be a better healer than he might have been without that painful lesson. Anna, who had been listening quietly from her bed, spoke up. "Dr. Cole, you saved my life and Elizabeth's and baby Grace's. You've treated children and ranchers and everyone else who came to you needing help. You've proven that your past mistake doesn't define your future abilities. The only question is whether you're brave enough to accept that and keep helping people who need you." Martha nodded her agreement. "This town has been watching you these past 2 days. They've seen how you work, how you care, how you push through your own fears to do what's right. That's earned you trust and respect that most doctors would take years to build. Don't throw that away because of something that happened 3 years ago in a different place to a different version of yourself." Ethan sat quietly, feeling the weight of their words and the enormity of the choice before him. He could return to treating only animals, could maintain the safe boundaries he had established to protect himself from the risk of failure. Or he could accept Patterson's offer, could embrace the possibility of redemption and second chances, could choose to define himself not by his worst moment but by his commitment to learning and growing and helping others, despite his imperfections. The decision, when it finally crystallized in his mind, felt both terrifying and liberating. "I'll do it," he said quietly. "I'll work with you, Dr. Patterson. I'll try to be the kind of doctor who helps people even when I'm afraid, who learns from mistakes rather than being paralyzed by them, who brings healing to a place that needs it desperately." Patterson smiled broadly and extended his hand. "Welcome to Frontier Medicine, Dr. Cole. It's hard work and long hours, and you'll face challenges that would never happen in a city practice. But it's also some of the most meaningful work a physician can do, bringing care to people who have few other options for medical help." Over the following weeks, Red Creek transformed Ethan's clinic from a converted stable into a proper medical facility. Citizens donated supplies, helped with construction, and spread word throughout the territory that the town now had 2 doctors available. Patterson and Ethan established a partnership where Patterson supervised Ethan's work while also giving him increasing independence. As his confidence and skills developed, Anna recovered fully from her injuries, though she would always have a scar on her shoulder, as a reminder of the day that changed everything. She returned to her seamstress work, but also took on a new role as Ethan's informal advocate, telling everyone who would listen about the doctor who had saved her life despite being terrified of failing again. Elizabeth Hart brought baby Grace to the clinic regularly for checkups, each visit a reminder to Ethan of what he had accomplished when he chose courage over fear. Thomas Hart became one of Ethan's most vocal supporters in the community, crediting him with saving not just his daughter's life, but his wife's as well. 6 months after that transformative night with Anna's injury, Ethan stood on the porch of his expanded clinic, watching the Texas sunset paint the sky in brilliant oranges and reds. He thought about the journey that had brought him here, from Boston failure to Texas redemption, from hiding behind veterinary work to embracing human medicine again. Patterson joined him on the porch, handing him a letter. "This came from the Territorial Medical Board," he said. "I've been corresponding with them about your situation, providing documentation of your successful practice here and my supervision. They're willing to consider restoring your license if you complete certain requirements and continue demonstrating competent practice." Ethan took the letter, feeling a complex mixture of emotions. The license restoration would be meaningful, a formal recognition that his past failure did not permanently disqualify him from medicine. But he had learned over the past 6 months that his worth as a physician did not depend on official credentials or institutional approval. It depended on his willingness to show up, to help people who needed him, to learn from mistakes rather than being destroyed by them. Whether they restore the license or not, Ethan said quietly, "I'm going to keep practicing. This is where I belong, helping people in places like Red Creek where medical care is scarce and every doctor matters. I'm not the physician I was in Boston, trying to build a prestigious career. I'm someone different now, someone shaped by failure and rebuilt through second chances. And I think that makes me better at this work than I ever was before." Patterson nodded with satisfaction. That's exactly the right answer. Medicine isn't about credentials or prestige or being perfect. It's about showing up for people in their most vulnerable moments and doing everything you can to help them through. You understand that now in ways you never could have, without experiencing failure, and choosing to keep trying anyway. As darkness settled over Red Creek and lights began appearing in windows across the town, Ethan thought about all the people he had helped over the past months, patients who trusted him with their pain and fear, families who welcomed him into their most intimate moments, children who would grow up healthier because he had been willing to face his own demons and practice medicine again. He thought about the woman and baby who had died in Boston, whose memory he would carry forever. But now he also thought about Anna Pierce, alive and thriving, about baby Grace Hart, growing strong and healthy, about the dozens of other patients who had received care because he had chosen redemption over permanent exile. The blood on his hands that terrible night in Boston would never fully wash away. Some stains, Ethan had learned, became permanent parts of who you were. But those stains did not have to define everything that followed. They could become reminders of why careful practice mattered, why humility was essential, why every patient deserved the best efforts of a physician who understood the weight of responsibility and the cost of failure. Ethan Cole had been a doctor who failed catastrophically. Now he was a doctor who had learned from that failure and chose daily to try again, to help again, to risk his heart and his hands in service of healing others. That journey from failure to redemption, from isolation to connection, from fear to courage was not a journey that ended. It was a journey that continued with each patient, each choice, each moment, when he decided that helping others mattered more than protecting himself from the possibility of failure.